Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Jasmin Dhaliwal, and my co-presenter is Cheng. And welcome to our webinar on EPA RMP, OSHA PSM Regulatory Environment Update, which is part of Risk Management Professionals webinar series. Our producer, Nick and Sarah, are in the background, keeping us operational throughout the webinar and taking any questions you may have. So just some logistics on the GoToWebinar platform. We're using GoToWebinar to interface to support our presentation. So if you experience any technical difficulties, please contact our office at 877-532-0806. We have staff available to help with troubleshooting. The image sizes for the presenter screen and PowerPoint presentation are also adjustable. So if you grab the inner point between the two boxes, you can adjust them to fit what looks best on your viewing device. So we also have a dialog box for questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them in the question box, and we will be happy to answer them at the end of our session during the question and answer portion. So this webinar series is part of RMP's ongoing outreach program. RMP's core competencies and expertise reside in EPA RMP, OSHA PSM, CalARP, and SAMS program development, as well as HAZOP and LOPA studies and other hazard identification techniques, and a variety of other process safety and regulatory standards and regulations, which you can find listed on the slide. So please feel free to email us or visit our website for more information. So to begin our presentation, here is an overview of the topics to be discussed. We'll provide an update on the EPA regulatory environment by reviewing the EPA National Enforcement Initiative for Chemical Accident Risk Reduction, as well as the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. We'll also cover two OSHA interpretation letters. One will provide an update on OSHA's current enforcement as it relates to the maximum commercial grade policy, as well as another OSHA interpretation letter which clarifies the definition of RAGAGEP in PSM enforcement. So to begin, what are EPA National Enforcement Initiatives? EPA selects national enforcement initiatives every 3 years to focus national efforts on national environmental problems with high rates of noncompliance. So starting October 1st, 2016, the EPA announced 7 of its initiatives. 4 of these are retained initiatives. 1 is an initiative they expanded upon, while they have introduced 2 new initiatives. So these EPA NEIs will be active for 3 years, from October 1st, 2016 to September 30th, 2019, or fiscal year 2017 through fiscal year 2019. Here are the 7 NEIs. The green are the retained initiatives, the blue is the expanded initiative, and the red are the new initiatives being introduced. So we will be focusing on the highlighted initiative, which is reducing risk of accidental releases at industrial and chemical facilities. Excuse me. So just to preface this presentation, much of this information we'll be covering is based off an EPA presentation provided to IIAR members that we wanted to share with anyone that was unable to attend. It is important to note that this was primarily for ammonia refrigeration facilities, and depending on the industry, the EPA approach may differ. But the overall purpose of this NEI is to increase oversight, look for opportunities for safer technologies, change corporate behavior, increase capacity for local emergency responders, and the overarching goal is to prevent chemical accidents. So all of the above aim to achieve this. What is the goal of NEI for industrial and chemical facilities specifically? So this is focused on helping prevent chemical accidents by identifying common causes of releases, to raise awareness of these potential common mode failures, as well as to increase awareness of regulatory requirements for industries. There is also a focus on helping identify opportunities of improved or safer technologies to help ensure facilities stay up to date with the ever-changing landscape of technology. So this is a focus point, as many facilities are existing facilities that may have been built between the 60s and early 90s. So the modernization of technology at these facilities can help improve efficiency of the facility, as well as help them operate more safely to prevent chemical accidental releases. The goal is to partner with organizations such as IIAR to improve safety, And the overall goal is about accident prevention and risk reduction rather than about increasing enforcement. As we mentioned earlier, this is tailored to ammonia refrigeration facilities, but they may also apply to other industrial and chemical facilities. Each of these goals may still apply for these facilities, but emphasis may be placed on different goals depending on the facility. So the overall impact of the new NEI for chemical accident risk reduction on industries is there is a possibility of more aggressive inspections and enforcement of a facility's RMP plans, risk management plans, depending on the industry. However, the current plan is not to hire more inspectors, nor is the plan to increase fines from what has already been listed through the current fine structure. And the current fine structure you can find on the EPA's website. In addition to the EPA NEI update, there have been other developments affecting the EPA regulatory environment. And I'll hand off the presentation to my co-presenter, Ivan, who will speak a little bit about these changes.
As Jasmin mentioned, I will be giving an update to some of the other changes that have been affecting the EPA regulatory environment. This includes the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. We will touch on this law passed in June of this year, but this is not meant to be a comprehensive overview. This law amends the 1976 Toxic Substances Control Act, which was the nation's primary chemical management law. It is important to note that this does not necessarily affect RMP directly, but can affect the usage and manufacturing of various chemicals, resulting in the need possibly for substitutes depending on the regulations that end up occurring. According to the EPA, improvements include mandatory requirement for the EPA to evaluate existing chemicals with clear and enforceable deadlines. There is now going to be a new risk-based safety standard and an increased public transparency for chemical information, as well as a built-in consistent source of funding for the EPA to carry out the responsibilities under the new law. In summary, what does this law actually change? It sets the time frame to evaluate chemicals and provides industries with information on the acceptability of manufacturing and use of these chemicals at current levels. The law may adjust which chemicals can be used and in what quantities, and may result in changes to operating practices to be required. This can vary anywhere from using inherently safer chemicals to restricting the use of a chemical which may affect industries or processes that use or manufacture these chemicals. There are other aspects to this law, as we have only highlighted a small portion of this law. As part of the Toxic Substance Control Act, there are other portions of this that deal with pre-manufacturing notices and getting approval for chemicals, but we've only selected a small portion of this law to mention. And a full detailing of this law is available on the EPA's website. On November 29, 2016, the EPA announced the first 10 chemicals to be analyzed. As you can see here, some of these chemicals have been analyzed once before. However, these will be reanalyzed according to the new risk-based safety standard. And based on these results, new regulations may or may not be proposed. So there have been tentative plans to release regulations based off trichloroethylene, N-methylpyrrolidine, and methylene chloride. Those are the three chemicals that have been analyzed. And if regulations do occur prior to them reanalyzing them, they may be changed based off of this. As a further update on the regulatory environment, there are proposed changes to the EPA RMP. These proposed changes have been available to the public for a couple of years now, and we have previously presented a webinar on these changes. If you are interested in viewing this, it is available on our company's website, or the updated proposed regulation can be found directly on the EPA's website if you haven't seen them already. Some of the recent developments include the changing political landscape. The proposed change on the EPA RMP were tied to Executive Order 13650, as a result of the West Fertilizer Plant explosion incident. However, with the upcoming change in administration, there is a possibility that Executive Order 13650 will be rescinded or changed, but nothing is confirmed or set. We will continue to monitor the regulatory environment, and a future webinar will be presented if and when this amendment is ratified. This concludes the EPA regulatory environment update portion of our presentation. Our next topic will be the OSHA interpretation letters. So, as mentioned in the outline, the two OSHA interpretation letters we will discuss are listed. The 721.6 letter we will review provides an update on the OSHA's current enforcement policy as it relates to maximum commercial grade. And the 511/2016 letter details and defines RAGAGEP and PSM enforcement. Jasmin will be speaking on the 721.16 letter.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Ivan. Okay, so in order to understand the new July 2016 OSHA interpretation letter, it's important to give some background with the June 1993 OSHA interpretation letter, since the July 2016 one replaced and rescinded the older letter. So in June of 1993, OSHA released an interpretation letter which required chemicals listed in Appendix A without minimum concentrations to be covered at commercial grade concentrations or higher. This letter defined commercial grade as a typical maximum concentration of the chemical that is commercially available and shipped. And employers could determine the maximum commercial grade by referring to any published catalog of chemicals for commercial sales. But as of July 2016, OSHA released an updated interpretation letter, which actually also rescinds a June 5th, 2015 update. I will touch upon this letter a little later in the presentation. The OSHA 2016 interpretation letter rescinds the maximum commercial grade policy and adopts the 1% test similar to the EPA. So the 1% test is utilized if a regulated chemical is in a mixture at a ratio greater than 1% by weight and no listed concentration exists on the list of chemicals in Appendix A. This rule also considers only the weight of the chemical itself within a mixture, excluding solvent, solution, or carrier. An exception to this rule is when the partial pressure of a chemical in a mixture is less than 10 millimeters of mercury, then the chemical is not included in PSM applicability determination. So this is the 1% test. The new enforcement policy requires employers to determine whether their process involves a chemical pure or in a mixture at or above threshold quantities listed in Appendix A by calculating either the total weight of the chemical in the process at a concentration that meets or exceeds the concentration listed for that chemical in Appendix A, or chemicals with no concentration specified in Appendix A, the total weight of that chemical in the process at a concentration of 1% or greater. And I have provided two examples in the following slides to help clarify this rule for you. So our first example involves a process comprised of 1,000 pounds of a mixture containing 10% diborane by weight. So is this process covered by PSM? So first you need to calculate the amount of the highly hazardous chemical you have by multiplying the weight of the chemical by the concentration. So in this case, we multiply 1,000 pounds by 10% to find 100 pounds of diborane in your process. So yes, this process is regulated by PSM because the threshold quantity of diborane is 100 pounds and the calculated amount of highly hazardous chemical in your process is 100 pounds. So our second example involves a process comprised of 10,000 pounds of 50% diacetyl peroxide solution. Is this process covered by PSM? So no, diacetyl peroxide is specifically listed in Appendix A at concentrations of greater than 70%. So solutions with diacetyl peroxide at less than this concentration are not covered by PSM, regardless of the total amount of the highly hazardous chemical you have. So as I mentioned before, the new July 2016 interpretation letter replaces the June 5th, 2015 interpretation letter. And OSHA originally clarified its stance on maximum commercial grade with this June 2015 interpretation letter. We did present a webinar on this topic, however, it's been replaced by this new interpretation letter, so it's no longer applicable. So some differences between the June 5th, 2015 interpretation letter and the July 2016 interpretation letter is that the July 2016 interpretation letter adds in clarification on the treatment of aqueous chemicals. So it specifically mentions that if a chemical is listed as anhydrous within Appendix A, it is not covered by PSM when it is in an aqueous solution or mixture. So here's a table of the anhydrous chemicals listed in Appendix A. So these are not covered when in aqueous solutions or mixtures. An exception is anhydrous ammonia because a separate entry exists in Appendix A for ammonia solutions at greater than 44% by weight. So how is OSHA enforcing this new interpretation letter? So until March 31st, 2017, OSHA will not cite facilities for violation of the PSM standard based on this new interpretation. However, during this time, PSM citations may still be issued based on the previous commercial grade concentration policy. From April 1st, 2017, so after the March 31st deadline, through March 31st, 2018, processes are covered by the 1% test. So they will issue citations if you're found in violation of this test. So OSHA, but during this period, OSHA will not conduct program inspections of such processes, and you will not be cited under the PSM standard for any PSM violations involving processes if the employer is making good faith efforts to come into compliance with PSM by March 31st, 2018. So in this context, in good faith means that employers can demonstrate that they are actively working and documenting that they are attempting to comply with the standard. But this policy does not apply to cases involving a fatality or catastrophe at a facility. So that concludes our review of the July 2016 OSHA interpretation letter. I will now hand it over to Ivan, who will discuss the May 2016 OSHA interpretation letter on RAGAGEP and PSM enforcement.
Thank you, Jasmin. So the other interpretation letter we will discuss was passed in May 11, 2016, and provides clarification on recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices, which we will be referring to as the more commonly used term RAGAGEP throughout this presentation for simplicity's sake. Before we begin, we will provide some background information on RAGAGEP. RAGAGEP is mentioned in 3 provisions within the PSM regulations. Employers must document that all equipment in PSM covered processes complies with RAGAGEP. Inspection and test are performed on process equipment subject to the standard's mechanical integrity requirements in accordance with RAGAGEP. And inspection and test frequency follows manufacturer's recommended and good engineering practice, and more frequently if indicated by operating experience. So you'll hear from that there is some subjectivity based off of the site-specific conditions and the process that you're looking at. It's not meant to necessarily be a blanket statement. So as you can see, RAGAGEP is used throughout the PSM standard, but no official guidance was provided, and as such, OSHA wanted to provide further insight. Some examples of RAGAGEP that OSHA has provided include widely adopted codes. These are consensus standards that have been widely accepted by federal, state, and municipal jurisdictions. An example would be NFPA 70 or the National Electric Code. These are all codes and standards that are generally recognized as best practice. Number 2 would be consensus documents. This refers to documents that are widely used as sources of RAGAGEP by those in industry. This includes how organizations like ASME follow the ANSI essential requirements when developing consensus standards and recommended practices. Examples of consensus documents include using the ASME process piping code or the ANSI or IAR code for ammonia refrigeration systems. Some industries also develop non-consensus documents. These are still widely accepted as good practices, but they aren't necessarily adopted everywhere. This includes things like following manufacturers' recommendations or following an institute's recommendation that is applicable to your process. And finally, the last would be internal standards, which refers to the ability of employers to develop internal standards within their corporation. However, employers must still demonstrate that these standards represent RAGAGEP. So why would employers choose to develop internal standards to comply with RAGAGEP? We have presented 5 of the following reasons outlined by the OSHA interpretation letter. Number 1, translating the requirements of published RAGAGEP into detailed corporate or facility implementation programs and or procedures. As we mentioned earlier, every site is different, even if it is the same type of process. So RAGAGEP is meant to be a general outline, but facilities may need to do something more specific, or the company itself might put a different standard that is higher than RAGAGEP and they want to outline that. Number 2 would be setting design, maintenance, inspection, and testing requirements for unique equipment for which no other RAGAGEP exists. Again, every site is different. You may be using something that you had custom made for your facility. So in that case, you need to develop something on your own. Number 3, supplementing or augmenting RAGAGEP selected by the employer that only partially or inadequately addresses the employer's equipment. Number 4, controlling hazards more effectively than the available codes and consensus and or non-consensus documents when deemed necessary by the employer's PSM program. So again, as we mentioned earlier, RAGAGEP does modify based off of operating experience, site-specific conditions. So you may need to do something more regardless of what RAGAGEP states to adequately ensure worker safety. And then number 5 would be addressing hazards when the codes and consensus and or non-consensus documents used for existing equipment are outdated and no longer described as good engineering practice. So these standards are published on set time frames. So in the years between the new issues, sometimes new technologies, new research comes out that shows that maybe there is a better way to do it. And so you can develop your own internal standard to make sure that you're securing worker safety by incorporating all of these technologies prior to the RAGAGEP standard from catching up. As outlined, OSHA PSM does not intend for the use of internal standards to allow companies from not meeting RAGAGEP at minimum. So you can go above and beyond, but you cannot go below RAGAGEP. OSHA has also provided some clarification on their interpretation of wording used in RAGAGEP standards. We will discuss shall/must or similar language versus should/ or similar language. Shall or must wording reflects that a practice is mandatory to meet RAGAGEP and a deviation is assumed to be a violation by OSHA. However, in the event of a violation due to deviation from a shall or must practice, the employer will still have an opportunity to provide an explanation on why they feel their practice still meets RAGAGEP prior to the citation becoming official. Should wording reflects that a practice is acceptable and preferred practice. However, it is not mandatory to meet RAGAGEP. However, deviation from should or should not means that an employer still needs to document how their practices meet RAGAGEP. So you can do something else, but you need to show clearly that you are still meeting RAGAGEP. As such, deviation is not assumed to be a violation by OSHA, provided that the required documentation and explanation is present. So just like everything else in OSHA PSM, documentation is critical. You can be following everything that you are supposed to be doing, but if documentation does not exist, OSHA and any other regulatory agency essentially treats it as if you're not doing it. So documentation is key. Other wording that OSHA has provided clarification on is normative versus informative. Normative explains how to comply with the code and/or consensus document requirements. Normative sections of a RAGAGEP standard may contain both shall and should language. Informative, however, provides background and reference information with respect to the code and/or consensus document requirements. Informative sections of RAGAGEP helps to identify and/or address hazards or acceptable means of abatement of these hazards. Employers should read and consider the informative sections. However, OSHA does not expect employers to consult all sources cited in the informative section. So we have outlined a few select enforcement considerations that we have found more helpful. However, a full list can be found in the interpretation letter. For reference, there are 16 enforcement considerations that OSHA has published in their letter, and we have only selected 4. So the first one we selected was multiple RAGAGEP may apply to a specific process. For example, API 520 or ISO standard number 4126-9 are both RAGAGEP for relief valve installation and contain similar but not identical requirements. Both documents are protective and either is acceptable to OSHA. So there is, again, as we mentioned, based off the site-specific conditions, you can choose the standard that you feel better applies to your process. Number 2, some employers apply RAGAGEP outside of their intended area of application, such as using ammonia refrigeration pressure vessel inspection recommended practices in a chemical plant or refinery process. This can result in poor hazard control and can be grounds for citation. The hazards in an ammonia refrigeration process obviously differ greatly from a refinery, so the two standards cannot be applied ubiquitously between the two. You have to use the standard that most applies to your process. Number 3, there may be cases where selected RAGAGEP does not control all of the hazards in an employer's covered process. As discussed above, the employer is expected to adopt other RAGAGEP in this event. As part of this, employers only need to consider or comply with RAGAGEP provision if it is applicable to their site-specific worksite conditions, situation, or application. So similar to everything else we've discussed, you take the RAGAGEP that applies to your worksite. So if it doesn't apply in portions, then you do not need to consider that portion. However, everything should fall under RAGAGEP of a RAGAGEP standard of some sort. Number 4, employers must document that their covered process equipment complies with RAGAGEP. Equipment that does not comply with RAGAGEP cannot be documented as compliant. Therefore, both the failure to document compliance and the deviations from compliance with RAGAGEP can be the basis for citation. So as we mentioned before, documentation is key. You can be doing everything that you're supposed to be doing, but if it's not documented, it can be grounds for a citation. This includes if the standard is being followed, if the standard being followed is more strict than RAGAGEP. So again, even if you're going above and beyond, you still need to document that RAGAGEP is being followed. So here are some of the references that we have used. They are in the handout that has been distributed to you on signing up for the webinar. So if you're curious about seeing exactly more information on any of the things discussed, you can look at one of these references and get more clarification. So we have some upcoming webinars. So there is one coming up on January 26th, which is an overview of independent protection layers, and this is part 3 of our LOPA webinar series. On February 16th, we also have an upcoming webinar on IAR standards and how they apply to RAGAGEP. This is also a part 3. And we will also be at March 20 at the Global Conference of Process Safety between March 26th and 30th. We actually have 2 presentations that we will be giving, so feel free to say hi to us if you happen to be there. And as we mentioned earlier, if the RMP regulations do become ratified, this schedule may be adjusted to have a webinar to discuss potential changes, or in the event that it isn't ratified, we will also release a more up-to-date regulatory environment as the political landscape changes. All right. So the audio and PowerPoint presentations are recorded and will be available for viewing in about a week. And that concludes our webinar on the EPA regulatory environment, as well as an update to the OSHA PSM interpretation letters. We'll be taking questions from our producers now. So if you have any questions that you feel weren't addressed or anything specific, you can type in your chat box and let our producers know, and we'll attempt to answer them if we can during this meeting. But if it's something site-specific, then we may need to get back to you at a later time. Over here a little bit.
Yeah. Centered.
So our first question is there a time frame for when the proposed EPA RMP change?
Okay.
So there have been some dates that we've heard. So the original date we had heard was December 2016 in another EPA presentation that we attended. However, it's now about halfway through December, and the regulations haven't come out, which doesn't necessarily mean that they won't come out toward the end of the month, but it's looking less likely. So we did also reach out to an EPA representative, and they said they were not certain when the official time frame would be, and it would be an ever-changing situation. So as we find out more, we'll let you know, but there is not currently a set date. Any other questions? All right. Well, that concludes our webinar then. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again.